Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. For those of you who are wondering, yes, I am aware that I am wearing headphones. The reason I am doing so is because there seems to have been some sort of a technical glitch with some of the sound, and I am trying to monitor the sound. However, okay, it does seem to be working, so I'm not going to bother because I find it very distracting wearing the headphones. Okay. So now that we got that straight, we're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey, and we're going to be doing today Daf Kuf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. We're continuing to learn Hilchas Yom Tov. We're holding in Siman Tov Kuf Zayin, and we are in the midst of Sif Dalet. So just to recapture what we learned yesterday, we learned basically here in Sif Dalet that began on Kuf Chav Beis Amud Beis. We learned three different halachas. If you want to break down what we did so far in Sif Dalet, it really is three halachas. The first halacha is, the Mechaber said, if you have an oven, and again, we were speaking about the type of ovens that they used in the days of the Mishnah, in the days of the Gemara to bake bread, and that was an oven that was closed on the sides and on the bottom, and it opened up on the top. The way that they would bake bread is they would take dough and they would stick it to the side walls of the oven. The burning coals and the fuel for the oven would be all the way down on the bottom on the floor of the oven, but that's not where you did your baking. So even though you had hot coals down there, they didn't interfere with the baking. They didn't damage the dough in any way. It didn't char it. It didn't singe it. However, sometimes you would have a problem where the inside lining of this oven, it was smeared with some kind of lime or some kind of tit. Sometimes that plastering on the side walls of the oven, a piece or a shard would fall off and it would fall down to the bottom of the oven. But I guess sometimes they were tall and they would stick up to the actual place where the dough would be placed on the side wall of the oven. If that were to happen, then you may have a shard of plaster that was in a location of the oven where it could touch the dough and it could singe or char the bread. So in the first halacha in Sif Dalet, what the Mechaber said was, if a piece of the plaster fell off and it fell down to the bottom of the oven and it's not positioned so that it could singe the bread, then you're not allowed to remove that shard from the oven. And the reason is because that shard is muktzah, and you're not allowed to be metaltal it shaloi l'tzarich. If it's not going to burn the bread, there's no tzarich for you to remove it, and therefore you're not allowed to remove it. That was one halacha. Now I'm going to go out of order. In the third halacha that we said yesterday from the Mechaber, we said, if, however, the shard of plaster that fell down into the oven, if it is positioned somewhere where it may singe or char the bread, then you are allowed to remove it. Because even though it's muktzah, this would be considered tiltal l'tzarich. And tiltal l'tzarich eichel nefesh, tiltal of muktzah, l'tzarich eichel nefesh, that's mutter. The Mishnah Berurah said that in Ois Cotton Chaf Aleph. He said, the mutter l'taltal muktzah l'tzarich eichel nefesh. You're allowed to handle something that's muktzah on Yom Tov l'tzarich eichel nefesh. So if there's a piece of plaster that's in danger of coming into contact with the dough that you're going to put on the side of the oven, even though it's muktzah, you're allowed to remove it. Now, the middle halacha that the Mechaber said yesterday in Sif Dalet was that how about forget stuff that falls off the side of the oven. We said that the fuel, the burning coals, and the ashes from all the burning fuel, that's all at the bottom of the oven. And sometimes what happens is at the bottom of the oven, it piles up. And sometimes it doesn't pile up evenly either. Sometimes you have peaks and valleys at the bottom of the oven. And sometimes you may have a peak of burning coals or of hot ash that are too high, and that may come into contact with the dough. So over there, the Mechaber said that if you have ash, if you have fire, burning coals, and you have afer, you have ashes that are at the bottom of the oven, you are allowed to smooth it out so that it should not come into contact with the dough. And you're allowed to do that even if there really is no danger that the coals or the ash are going to singe the dough. Even if it's only going to make the dough a little bit dirty, it's going to get some ash on the dough, you're allowed to smooth out the coals and the ashes that are on the bottom of the oven. And the Mishnah Berurah explained that the reason for the difference between the coals and the ash and the shards that fall off the side of the oven is because the shards that come off the side of the oven, those are muktzah, but the coals and the ash are not muktzah. Since they're hot and they're fuel for cooking, those are not muktzah. Since they're not muktzah, you're allowed to move them. You're allowed to go level them out. However, the Mishnah Berurah did point out yesterday, and that's what we're going to learn about today, that it would seem from the Mechaber that you're allowed to smooth them out, but you're not allowed to remove them. Why aren't you allowed to remove them? So the Mishnah Berurah suggested yesterday that it could be that when you remove the hot coals and the ash from the bottom of the oven, you're going to extinguish them. And that would be kibui shalai l'tzarech. That would be extinguishing it for no reason. You don't have to remove it. Just go ahead and smooth it out. And even when you smooth it out, you could smooth it out in a way where you're not going to extinguish anything that's burning over there. Okay, so that's what we learned yesterday. Now, having that in mind, let's take a look at Kuf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. By me, it's near the end of the first line, right by the Ois Katan Chav Beis for the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mechaber, V'dafka b'tanurim shelahem. This halacha, I'm going to translate this the way the Mishnah Berurah is mefarish it. This halacha that we said yesterday, that you're not allowed to remove the coals of the ash from the bottom of the oven, because by doing so, you're going to be mechaber the fire, you're going to extinguish the fire. V'dafka b'tanurim shelahem. That was only true in the ovens that they had in those days. Those are the ovens that we described, where the fuel is on the bottom floor of the oven, but the baking is done on the side walls of the oven. Shahayu medabkim hapas sevivam, where you stuck the dough on the side walls, around the sides of the oven. Ve'ein tzrichim legarfam, and therefore you really don't have to sweep out the bottom of the oven. You can have burning coals and hot ash at the bottom of the oven. There's really no reason for you to remove it. It's not impeding the baking at all, because the baking doesn't take place on the bottom floor of the oven. So there's no need to sweep out the floor of the oven, only if plaster fell off the sides of the oven and fell into the bottom, then you want to remove that plaster, either because it's going to stick up and impede the baking, or because it's the wrong type of material, it's going to smother the fire that's on the bottom floor of the oven. So that you theoretically would have to remove. But the burning coals and the afer, the ashes from the bottom of the oven, there's really no need to go ahead and remove it. Aval tanurim shalanu. But our ovens, says the Mechaber, even in the time of the Shulchan Aruch, our ovens, where the baking is done on the floor of the oven, since you can't bake in our ovens without sweeping away the ashes and the coals from the floor of the oven. Because by us, the baking is done on the floor of the oven. Now, you can't bake the dough on top of burning hot coals and burning hot ashes. The dough will just catch fire and will just burn up. So in our oven, says the Mechaber, you must sweep away the ashes and the coals in order to bake. And therefore, says the Mechaber, mutter legarfan meha efer v'hagecholim. Therefore, it's permissible with our ovens to sweep away the ashes and the coals. And like the Mishnah Berurah is going to explain, what the Mechaber is saying is, in their ovens, you are not allowed to sweep out the bottom of the oven if there's a risk that you're going to extinguish the fire, because that would be kivui shalai l'tzarech. You're extinguishing a fire for no need. You don't need to clear out the bottom of the oven in order to bake. You're baking around the sides of the ovens. But with our ovens, you do need to sweep out the bottom floor of the oven, because that's where you do the baking, on the bottom floor of the oven. Therefore, you're allowed to sweep out the floor of the oven even if you're going to extinguish a fire. And he explains why. This is mutter even though you're going to extinguish a fire, because it's not possible to bake without doing this. And the same way you're permitted to make a fire havara, burning a fire, is mutter on Yom Tov l'tzarech eichel nefesh. It's also permissible to extinguish a fire. This is no different than if you're roasting meat. You're allowed to take meat and you're allowed to place it onto burning coals, even though there's no question that when you have a burning coal and now you take meat and you put it down on top of the coal, it's going to be mechabe the fire. It's definitely going to at least somewhat extinguish the fire of the coal. You're blocking the oxygen supply. You're smothering the coal with the meat. The juices from the meat are running down onto the hot coals. So you're definitely going to at least somewhat extinguish the fire of the coals, and yet you're allowed to do that because that's the cooking process. And you're allowed to do kibui l'tzarech eichel nefesh the same way you're allowed to do havara l'tzarech eichel nefesh. V'chein nahagu. And the Mechaber says, and indeed, that is what we are accustomed to doing. So again, in a nutshell, what the Mechaber has said over here is, yesterday we said you're not allowed to sweep out the bottom of the oven from the ashes and the coals because you might extinguish fire by doing that, and that would be kivui shaloi l'tzarech. Says the Mechaber today, that's by their ovens where they did not bake on the bottom floor of the oven, and therefore whatever was going on the bottom floor of the oven did not impede in any way the baking process. And therefore there's no tzarech eichel nefesh to clean out the floor of the oven, and you can't do kivu, you can't extinguish anything because it would be shaloi l'tzarech. But with our ovens, where we do bake on the floor of the oven, we must clear out the floor of the oven, otherwise we can't bake. And therefore it's mutter, even if you're going to do kivui, because that would be kivui l'tzarech eichel nefesh. Now let's go on Kuf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph to Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Chav Beis, where the Mishnah Berurah is going to really spell this out. First, the Mishnah Berurah points out that the lashon of the Mechaber over here is somewhat imprecise, because if you don't have the whole hakdama that I gave you, and you don't explain which halacha the Mechaber, which halacha of yesterday the Mechaber is going back on, it's not very clearly spelled out. So says the Chavetz Chaim, halashon megumgum tzas. The language of the Mechaber, when the Mechaber says v'dafka b'tanurim shalohem, that this halacha only applies to their ovens, he doesn't express really which halacha he's referring to. So the Chavetz Chaim points out here the lashon is begungum k'tzas. U'barash shemimenu neivei advarim elu isikain. However, in the words of the Rush and the words of the Mechaber over here flow from the words of the Rush says the following. We find that the Chazal were not matter you to remove from the floor of the oven ela tiach shel tanur, only shards of plaster that fell off the sides of the oven, dehu rak tiltul muktzah. That the Chachamim were matir because that's only a muktzah problem. The shard of plaster that fell into the bottom of the oven is muktzah. It's an issa d'Rabbanan, and therefore you're allowed to move it if there's a possibility that it will ruin the bread. Aval goref gechalim, but to sweep out the bottom floor of the oven from the coals and from the ashes, the bali de kibuy al yedei, that's something that would bring to the malacha of mechabe. By doing that, you would be extinguishing fire. Lo hitiru. That we don't find the Chazal wa matir. We saw yesterday the Chazal wa matir you if a piece of plaster fell into the bottom of the oven and it's in danger of singeing the bread, then you're allowed to remove it. We said also you're allowed to smooth out the ashes and the coal on the bottom of the oven. But we were not matir to remove the ashes and the coals from the bottom of the oven because that would involve the malacha of mechabe. And mechabe, we can't be matir if it's shaloi l'tzarech. However, continues the Chavetz Chaim, this is what the Mechaber is saying in today's halacha, v'chol zeh b'tanurim shalahem. That's only true in the types of ovens that they had in the days of the Gemara. where the dough for the bread was stuck on the side walls of the oven. And therefore, the coals that are on the bottom of the oven are not able lisraif hapas. They're not going to burn the bread. The coals and the hot ashes all the way on the bottom of the oven are not going to burn the dough that's stuck to the sides of the oven. The only possible risk to the bread is that the coals and the ashes might singe the bread a little bit. And for that, we're matter you to smooth out the ashes and the coals. But to remove the ashes and the coals, we will not matter. Because that would involve the malacha of mechabe, and that would be mechabe shaloi l'tzarech, and we can't be matter that. Aval b'tanurim shalanu, however, says the mechaber, with our ovens, sha'ifim b'tachtes hatanur, where we do the baking on the floor of the oven, afilu gechalim muter ligroif. Even the hot coals you're allowed to remove from the floor of the oven, even if it's going to cause extinguishing, even if you're going to perform the malacha of mechabe. Why? Because if we do not remove the burning coals and the burning ash from the floor of the oven, it's impossible to bake, because we need to bake on the floor of the oven. Zeu teichen divrei Rosh. This is the thrust and the context of the words of the Rosh. V'chein hu kavanas hamechaber. And the Chavetz Chaim says that is the meaning of the mechaber's words that we read today. Okay, now we go to Ois Katan Chav Gimel. Kevan she'efsher. The reason this kibui is mutter is because without it, it's impossible to bake. Why is it impossible to bake? Hainu sheti saref. Because if we try to bake on the floor of the oven, when there are hot coals and hot ashes on the floor of the oven, the dough that we put down over there is going to burst into flame and it's going to burn. V'em hataner gadol. However, if you're dealing with a very large oven, and the burning coals are all the way to the side, they're located in one part of the floor of the oven, pataner. Usha'ar hataner ponui, and the rest of the floor of the oven is clear, sheyocha lefas hapas b'lei geruf, so that you can bake bread without sweeping out the floor of the oven. Ela da'asa l'garef hagechalim, and just you want to sweep out the coal, kedei shelo smuchin lapas. You want to distance the coal a little bit further away from the dough, because shema yehe necharach b'tzasai, because you're afraid that the dough might get singed a little bit. Aser, that's forbidden. It's only mutter to sweep out the floor of the oven and cause kibui if it's mamish impeding the baking. But if it's not really impeding the baking, if all the coals and the ashes are really pushed to one side of the oven, and you have the other side of the oven where you can bake, just as a little bit of a risk that the bread might get a little bit singed, then you have no heter to go ahead and sweep out the oven and cause kibui. The chenem similarly, im garaf hatanor mehagechalim hagedolim, if you did sweep out the oven from the large burning coals, and just v'nisharu gechalim getanim, and there are some little pieces of coal that remain, v'nitzoitzos, and there are little burning sparks, little burning embers on the floor of the oven, ba'ofen shelo yisaref hapas, where that's not going to burn the bread and might make a little black marks on the bread, but it's not going to burn the bread. Rak efsher sheyeh nechrach tzas, just the dough will become slightly charred where it touches a small coal or where it touches a small burning ember. Also, legarfam pam shnia, then it would be forbidden to sweep out the floor of the oven a second time to attempt to get rid of all of these tiny little embers. Mishum kibui, that would be also because when you do sweep out those burning embers, you're going to extinguish them. And that's not enough of a tzarech eichel nefesh to go ahead and do this kibui so that the bread should not get a tiny bit singed in a couple of places. That's not called a tzarech eichel nefesh, and that would not be mutter. Ois katan chav dalid. The Mechaber said, if you're baking on the floor of the oven and the coals and the ashes are on the floor and it's going to impede the baking, then mutter legarfan me'efer v'hagachalim, then you're allowed to sweep out the floor of the oven from the ash and from the burning coal, says the Chavetz Chaim, va'afilu b'machbedes tvlula b'mayim. You would even be allowed to use a broom that was dipped in water so that you're really doing extinguishing. You're using a wet broom to sweep out these burning coals. So your mamish going to do kibui. It's still mutter in tzarech lazeh. If that's what you need, it's mutter because that's called kibui l'tzarech echel nefesh. Ukidol kamei b'sif hey. Ois cotton chav hey. The Chavetz Chaim says this is mutter. V'harezeh kemaniach basar al gabe gecholim. This would be no different than laying down meat on top of hot coals, litzloisai, in order to roast the meat. And we know that that's certainly permissible. Even though as soon as you put the meat down on the coals, to a certain extent, the meat is going to extinguish the fire of the coals, mutter, it's still permissible, because that's considered a tzarech echel nefesh. Now, he draws a contrast between this and a different halacha. This is not similar, says the Chavetz Chaim, to the custom that they had when they would prepare mustard. They would take a burning hot coal and they would stick it down into a pile of mustard seed. And the coal would get extinguished by the mustard seed. The mustard seed would smother the coal, and then the mustard seed would get charred and it would get smoked. And this had an effect of sweetening the mustard seed. Says the Chavetz Chaim, this is not the same as that halacha, the osir. We find that that's osir on Yom Tov. You're not allowed to take the burning coal and stick it down into the mustard seed, because by doing so, you're extinguishing the burning hot coal. So you're doing mechaber. So now the Chavetz Chaim is drawing a contrast between the halacha we just learned and that halacha. You might ask me, why can't you stick the burning hot coal into the mustard seed? Why don't we say that that's kibui l'tzarech echel nefesh? You're doing it in order to prepare some delicious mustard. Yet we see that that's aser. Kidul l'kamon b'siman tov kuv yud siv gimel. So the Chavetz Chaim explains why. He says, the mustard is ready to be eaten without doing this process of sticking the coal down into the mustard seed. Ela mifunakim, feinschmeckers, mechabim gacheles b'soichai. The mifunakim, those connoisseurs, they put the coal into the mustard seed to make the mustard extra special. But that's not something which is shavu l'chol nefesh. That's not a malacha that everybody agrees is required for echel nefesh. Most people eat mustard without doing that. You have a few connoisseurs who insist on doing that. Something that's not shavu l'chol nefesh is not mutar on Yom Tov. So even though you'll say that kibui is tzarech echel nefesh, if it's something which only connoisseurs recognize as being tzarech echel nefesh, that's not mutar on Yom Tov. Masha'en kain, what we're talking about over here, where you want to go ahead and sweep out the floor of the oven so you could bake, everybody agrees that you need to do that in order to bake your bread. Otherwise, your bread is going to ignite and burn. Void, and additionally, this process of sweetening the mustard seed, the Chavetz Chaim says, also could be done with a glowing hot piece of metal. You could take a red hot piece of metal and plunge it into the mustard seed, and that will also char the mustard seed and give it the sweet taste. Now, when you take a burning piece of metal and you extinguish it, that's not called the malacha of kibui. By metal, we don't have kibui. And that's also, it's something which is very common to do, and therefore there's no reason why should you go ahead and do kibui by using a wooden coal. Go ahead and use a hot piece of metal and you'll accomplish the same thing. Okay, today's share was a little bit on the shorter side, We're going to stop over here. We'll pick up tomorrow with Sif Hey. Thank you so much for joining me for Limud HaTorah. The schus of Limud HaTorah should stand against Klal Yisrael in good stead. Rabbi Shalom should send Yeshuas, Refuas, Parnasa. Rabbi Shalom should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. Everyone should have a ksiva, the ksiva taiva, good gebenched yar. Everybody should already be thinking about Slichas, about Rosh Hashanah, about the din that is upon us. Certainly after a year like this, we all could feel a little bit maybe more than usual. The Emas Hadin, the dread and the worry of the Yom Hadin. We see now, ask yourself, what was I doing last year Rosh Hashanah? What was my davening like last year Rosh Hashanah? I had no clue what was coming. I didn't know about this COVID-19. I didn't know what this year was going to be like. Now we see what a year could be. We have to be mispaled to the Rabbeinu Shalom. Next year should be a much better year. We should have a happy year, a simchadika year, a year of simchas, a year of, shall we say, normalcy, a year where we could all comport ourselves in a more normal fashion without the daigas and the worries and the concerns. Thank you so much. Be well.